Welcome to Radio Who, What, Why. I'm Jeff Schechtman. For centuries, writers have looked at how the inherent drama of war created heroes and villains and defined the image of the soldiers who fought in them. Yet we often overlook that the opposite is true. That in many cases, soldiers and their individual actions, both heroic and sometimes disgraced, have defined the nature of the wars in which they fought. Audie Murphy or Edward Slovic in World War II, John Paul Vance and William Calley in Vietnam, Lindy England in Iraq, and perhaps the story of Bowe Bergdahl in Afghanistan in 2009. That's the story that my guest Michael Ames has researched deeply and tells in his new book, American Cipher, Bowe Bergdahl and the U.S. Tragedy in Afghanistan. Michael Ames is a regular contributor to numerous publications, including The Atlantic, Slate, and The Believer. He spent 9 years in Idaho working as a newspaper reporter and magazine editor, and it is my pleasure to welcome Michael Ames to Radio Who, What, Why. Michael, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
For our listeners, give a quick thumbnail for those that don't remember, and it's been a while now, what the Bowe Bergdahl story was at core.
Well, most people remember Bowe Bergdahl for being released in a 2014 prisoner exchange ordered by President Obama, a lopsided exchange. He was exchanged for 5 Taliban officials held at Guantanamo Bay, which turned into a political firestorm that Republicans leveraged against President Obama successfully in many ways. But he was held in Pakistan for 5 years in brutal captivity, the longest held American POW since Vietnam. And he ended up there for a pretty strange reason, which is that he walked off his outpost unarmed and alone in the middle of the night. And people knew so little about what he had done and why he had done it for so long that rumors and innuendo and Taliban propaganda filled the vacuum. And only now that we've done this full research can we come to really see how the truth of his story reveals so much more about the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan.
Right. And there was so much that was reported at the time all around this idea that Bergdahl somehow was a deserter, that he had walked off as a deserter to get away from his responsibilities.
Well, it's true that he walked off. It's true that desertion is a crime and that he pled guilty to it. Now, his defense lawyers would argue that he went AWOL and was kidnapped while he was AWOL. And, of course, AWOL is a much lower level crime than desertion. But ultimately, he decided to plead guilty to desertion and throw himself at the mercy of the court.
One of the things that's so remarkable about this story is that it's so hard to remember it and understand it without the broader context that you provide in American Cipher as to who Bowe Bergdahl was and a little bit about his upbringing. Talk about that.
Right. Well, what we discovered through sources and particularly through Bergdahl's parents who spoke to us at great length is this was a well-intentioned, naive guy who was desperate to prove himself in a military way. He volunteered for the military on 2 different occasions. The first time for the Coast Guard, where he washed out of basic training with an anxiety attack, and the Coast Guard said that he could not re-enlist in the armed forces without clearance from a psychologist. And yet, when he went to re-enlist in the Army 2 years later, that requirement was waived, and they took him in despite some pretty legitimate mental health concerns.
Why did they let him in?
They needed people. They needed bodies. President Obama, to rewind here, refresh everybody's memories, President Obama did a significant, exhaustive review of Washington's Afghanistan policy. And he was lobbied heavily by the Pentagon to drastically increase America's troop presence, which he did. He didn't do it quite to the level that the generals wanted, but he did triple the American footprint on the ground in Afghanistan in a short period of time. So it was a significant surge, and they needed bodies on the front lines. And when they need bodies, they lower standards, and people get in. Now, most of the people who get in those lower standards will be people with criminal records or people with learning disabilities. In Bergdahl's case, it was someone with a unique psychological condition that has slipped through the cracks.
Tell us a little bit about his personality, about his upbringing, his self-centeredness, and yet he was kind. I mean, he had a lot of interpersonal skills, and yet sometimes they didn't work for him.
That's right. Well, ultimately, Army psychiatrists diagnosed him, two different one Army board of psychiatrists and then another forensic psychiatrist independently diagnosed him with something called schizotypal personality disorder, which is a rare personality disorder that tends to, some people call it schizophrenic light, and it leads people to have rich inner fantasy worlds and concoct grandiose ideas. Sometimes people with this disorder are highly intelligent, like the chess master Bobby Fischer, to cite one example. But it does not make for a good candidate for the social cohesion necessary in an Army unit.
Beyond the social skills, when he got to Afghanistan, it was pretty early on that he started talking about and questioning America's role there. Talk a little bit about that.
That's right. And I don't think he was unique in that way. We interviewed so many veterans, and Matt Farwell, my co-author, is himself an Army veteran who saw that things were different on the ground than they were described to people back home. And what he saw was very similar to a lot of complaints that a lot of guys had about the way the war was being fought and the way that the Army was or was not helping the local population in Afghanistan. But unlike all other people in that scenario, Bergdahl decided to do something crazy to fight the system on his own. And, of course, he walked into the worst kind of possible trap that he could.
He didn't have a lot of respect for the higher-ups either.
No, he didn't. But I think in some of those cases, what he saw was accurate. He saw higher-ups, commanders who were doing things for reasons other than the supposed and advertised causes of helping the Afghan people. He saw higher-ups doing things to please their own commanders. He saw higher-ups in one notable case put on a little tirade and kick an Afghan grave down just to sort of look like a tough guy. And for Bergdahl, who believed in this noble American mission that he signed up for, he found this totally shocking.
He made an effort to get to know some of the Afghan people. How much did he do that, and how effective was it?
Well, the Americans on his base shared the base with an adjacent area of Afghan National Police soldiers, which was common because the idea of the counterinsurgency, the plan, was to build up these bases and then turn them over to the Afghans to run on their own. So he, together with a couple of his friends in the platoon who, like him, were somewhat more thoughtful and guys who were more understanding and curious about the Afghan culture, they would go up and eat meals with the Afghan soldiers. They would try to get to know them, also, as Bergdahl said himself, as a precaution so that they didn't end up, with a murder on their hands, which happened in there's too many tragic instances to even cite of Afghan soldiers turning on and killing their American trainers.
Was there a particular moment for Bergdahl that he decided that he was going to do something like walk away from his post?
I think it was a gradual buildup of frustration, but seeing his lieutenant commander of the battalion kick an Afghan grave in a cemetery was a pretty big trigger for him that made him see that the emperor had no clothes and that what he signed up for was not as it was playing out on the ground.
How did he see the enemy? How did he see the Islamic terrorists that he was supposedly there fighting against? How did he view them?
Well, he certainly wasn't sympathetic to them, and that notion that he became a traitor or that he sympathized with them was picked up, of course, by the right-wing media and Republican operatives when it, in fact, was Taliban propaganda to start with. I mean, they were putting out false reports, and as readers will learn in the book and as we discovered from our sources, sometimes very elaborate Taliban disinformation campaigns feeding false stories to Western journalists about how Bergdahl had converted to Islam and was training fighters, and none of it was true. He saw them both beforehand and as their captives as barbaric people who treated women horrifically and who were hurting the average Afghan civilian.
Do you have a sense that after his capture, that anything in his attitude changed and anything in his outlook with respect to the American role there?
Well, I certainly can't speak for him precisely, but I would say that he was aware that they were looking for him. He could hear drones in the sky above him when he was in Western Pakistan, and he was so grateful when he was rescued and he actually figured out who the people on the helicopter were, that they were special forces. He took one of the soldiers' hands and just didn't let it go and just broke down crying out of gratitude. When
he was captured, talk a little bit about the conditions, and later, as you mentioned just a few moments ago, he was moved to the border on the Pakistan side.
He was moved across the border very early on, and the Taliban knew what they were doing. They put out false intelligence reports, filling the local radio chatter with false sightings to lure the Americans into traps and ambushes. And meanwhile, Bergdahl was whisked over the border, and within what's really incredible, what we discovered and what our sources told us, and what needs to be, I think, taken away here, is that soldiers were sent on dangerous missions to go looking for him, and they did as they were ordered. But they were sent on those missions after the Army already knew that Bergdahl was gone. The Army knew that he was in Pakistan, but they used him as a cover story to run aggressive raids and as a shortcut around rules of engagement that they didn't like.
Where were those decisions made with respect to the way the Army was going to play this out, and also the disinformation that they engaged in with respect to Bergdahl?
Excellent questions, both. On the first count, it was kind of a disorderly situation. We have to remember that at that point in the war, the top generals, Stan McChrystal and Mike Flynn, the same Mike Flynn who we now know from the Trump administration, had only just arrived in country a couple of weeks earlier. So they were just getting started. And there was, to answer your first question, by July 13th, so 13 days after he went missing, there was a consensus in the intelligence community that he was in Pakistan. But in CENTCOM, Central Command, part of the Pentagon that commands the wars out of Tampa Bay, they decided not to accept that intelligence, even after all the other intelligence agencies did. And why is that? So that they could continue sending men out on these aggressive raids to supposedly look for Bergdahl, which was really just a cover story.
There were also stories that Bergdahl had become an enemy combatant. Talk a little bit about where those stories emanated from.
Right, totally false, and those emanated, the origin of all those was Taliban propaganda, which was leaked out very strategically, in some cases to Western journalists, in some cases to intelligence assets on the ground. To give you one other example that readers can find in the book, U.S. Army soldiers would go into a small village with a briefcase full of cash and ask people, is it true that the soldier who was captured is a Taliban sympathizer? And they would say yes, and they would receive cash for telling them those stories. So there were a number of ways that these rumors became memorialized in intelligence reports when, in fact, none of them were based in reality.
It does seem that there were so many lies told and so much misinformation with respect to Bergdahl's story told by the U.S. military and things like the story you just told with respect to the cash, that after a while it was hard to know what the truth was.
Absolutely, and I think in that way Bergdahl is a good foreshadowing of the general American struggle right now with the truth and with facts and with information versus disinformation. To have to tie it to current events, The Trump administration is currently in peace talks with Taliban in Doha. This should be front page news in every paper in the country, but it isn't. More astounding, of that Taliban peace delegation are the 5 men who were released in the trade for Bergdahl himself. So we are now, the Trump administration, negotiating with men who Trump called terrorists and killers.
How did the negotiate? Well, let me ask you first, was Bergdahl tortured? What do we know about that?
He was tortured. It was the worst captivity any American had experienced since Vietnam. And in the book, you'll learn what we learned from our sources who debriefed Bergdahl and went into great detail about the torture, the neglect. The neglect was possibly even worse than the torture in the sense that he was malnourished. He became skin and bones. He suffered from severe dysentery for years. He tried to escape many times, in one case successfully escaping for 9 days. It's an incredible story.
Mm-hmm. What was the attitude of the Obama administration? What did they know about what was really happening on the ground over there with respect to Bergdahl, and how did they handle it?
Well, they thought they knew things because the military and the intelligence agencies have sources that were placed. But what they learned when Bergdahl came back is that they really didn't know as much as they thought, and that they really had very little insight into what was really the truth of his captivity. And the intelligence agencies and the military came to truly value Bergdahl as an intelligence asset upon his return. They debriefed him for over 80 hours and used that information to build classified reports that in many cases led directly to drone strikes taking out jihadists in western Pakistan.
How did the negotiations for his release get underway?
That is a very deep background story that is so complex. It's just incredible how little contact Washington had with the Taliban in any way, shape, or form. And the Obama administration and the State Department had to find people to go open channels to go talk to the Taliban, because under the Bush administration, the policy had been, we don't negotiate with the Taliban, period. Fast forward 15 plus years, and here we are doing just that.
And what form did those negotiations take?
Well, they were held in secret. They were held in Germany and in Doha. The Qatari government and the German government were co-mediators, hosting a very small team of Americans and one Afghan man who spoke on behalf of Mullah Omar. Those were extremely delicate negotiations that were very hard to put together, that required significant secrecy even within the U.S. government. So it's quite striking to think about how delicate that situation had to be handled by the Obama administration compared to what's happening right now under Trump.
And how well was it handled? What were the mistakes, and what did they do right?
You know, it's always easy to be a Monday morning quarterback on these things. They did a lot of things right, in the sense that they pursued the talks that were available to them to bring Bergdahl home. They did things wrong in the sense that they were stubbornly set on things, on conditions that would connote or suggest a greater leverage than we ever really had. We haven't really had leverage in that country in many, many years. And what our sources told us, what we discovered, is that the 5 guys Bergdahl was traded for were in many ways a foregone conclusion that the Taliban wanted them back. Now there were other trade possibilities that were looked into, as we discovered and as we write about. But the one that the State Department wanted to see through was this one with the Taliban officials.
And while all this played out, give us a little portrait of Bergdahl's parents and what they were seeing and what they were going through.
Well, they were embraced and taken in by the military in really astounding ways that were fairly unprecedented. If you think back to Vietnam and what POW families went through then, none of them were given the sort of treatment and access that the Bergdahls were. They were very close with Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, Admiral Mike Mullen, and with then General James Mattis, who of course went on to be Secretary of Defense. Mattis flew to their home at one point in Idaho. They were truly involved in the process, but they also didn't know that much because the American government didn't know that much. Their son had fallen into a black hole where no one could reach him or see into his conditions.
Once Bergdahl was released, tell us a little bit about how that played out.
Well, I saw it firsthand in Haley, Idaho, where I used to live, and I had friends who received death threats because they made the mistake of saying on camera that they were happy that the local boy had survived. And of course, once the media turned him into a pariah and vilified him, the local community was really whipsawed through a truly traumatizing event with the media. And I think it's a real indictment of how the political media entertainment system works in this country.
And what impact did that have on Bergdahl once he was out and he saw this playing out in the media?
Well, I mean, he knew that he was being vilified, and I think he had to he had to have a bit of a sense of humor about it, because you have to remember, and as you'll learn in the book, he was helping the military with intelligence debriefings and doing his best to do everything he could to lead the military and the CIA to go find terrorists in Pakistan. And meanwhile, on TV every night, they're calling him a terrorist sympathizer. So it was a real, sort of schizoid view of reality that he had to, I think, develop a pretty thick skin about.
And there was a pretty loud chorus of people that wanted him court-martialed or worse.
Absolutely, and he was court-martialed, but the degree to which he was court-martialed and the amount of money and time that the Army poured into that court-martial was determined by politics more than by the facts of the case, and that's what our reporting and our sources really show.
Mm-hmm. And finally, talk a little bit about Bergdahl today and how he's doing.
Well, I think he's ready to move on. This was obviously a horrific experience to be rescued and brought home, only to then learn that you're the most hated soldier in the Army. There's still guys in the Army out there who'd be happy to see Bergdahl hurt or worse, and so he has to be very careful, and he has to really live a very, very under the radar life. It's sad, but the worst of his trauma is over.
And does he talk about or have views on the American role in Afghanistan today? I mean, he was pretty vocal about it when he first got to country.
That's right. I don't know that he speaks about it now. He was pretty eager to get out of the public eye, and of course under legal advice not to talk too much about it either.
Michael Ames. The book is American Cipher, Bowe Bergdahl and the U.S. Tragedy in Afghanistan. Michael, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Schechtman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.